So did the Buddha feel pain? It's an interesting question that reveals more about the path that we're along. So I'll try to answer that question coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing to the channel. So this is a question asked by Jorge Seguel in my video on the Four Noble Truths. And it's a question I think it deserves a more public answer than one I could give just to him. We're going to answer this question about the Buddha, but it's more generally about the awakened state in general, what it's like, what it might be like to get to Nibbana, to get to awakening. And so we're going to use the Buddha as our exemplar, as an example of somebody who attained that state, presumably, by looking at the early texts, by looking at the texts in Pali in particular. That said, of course, the texts might be wrong. So what we're trying to do is to learn at least what the texts say. And, if we then decide that we dislike them or disagree with them or don't accept them, that's fine. Also, it's true that, we're going to be talking about a number of different categories here of people and of achievements and so on. And again, these are things that we should hold lightly, and they may be useful to us on our journey. They may not be useful to many of us on our journey. And if so, just leave them aside. But I think it's at least useful to know about them, to know about the way that the path was portrayed in the early texts, because it gives us something to spring off of. So as to the specific question, did the Buddha feel pain? The answer to that is very simple to give, but we're going to unpack that quite a bit. But the answer is yes, he did. I mean, in the early texts, there are several places where the Buddha did claim to feel physical pain. One of those is in one of the suttas, the Majjhima Nikaya 53, where the Buddha basically is giving a number of talks, and after talking for a long period of time, he, instead of continuing the talks the next day, he asks Ananda to take over from him because his back is sore, and he needs to lie down for a while. And so that's what he does. Ananda talks in his place, and the Buddha goes and lies down. So we know in that example that the Buddha had a sore back, that he had, low back issues perhaps, and that's something that's absolutely normal if you're sitting for a long period of time without a chair or even in a chair. So that's one example. Another example is in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which is the last sutta before the Buddha died. He talks about many of the pains and discomforts of aging. And in particular, after his what's called the final meal, where he ate his final meal, and it seems to have been not to have agreed with him, he talks about really tremendous pain, physical pain, probably bowel pain. It's not exactly clear what the problem was, but in any event, he talks about extreme pain. So these are two examples of where the Buddha said by his own account to feel physical discomfort, physical pain. So certainly he could. Now, going forward, what we want to say is that in the early texts, the awakening state of the Buddha was no different from the awakening state of anybody else. So we shouldn't think, in the early texts, at least in the Pali Canon, that other awakened people, his disciples, for example, who are called arahants. Arahant is the Pali word for an awakened person. The arahants were not in a different state from the Buddha himself. The difference between the Buddha and the other arahants is that the Buddha was the teacher. The Buddha was the person who first understood the Dhamma for himself and taught it to others. But the state that he achieved is no different from the state of anybody else who's awakened. So as a result, what I'm going to talk about here and what we should think of in the Buddha in general is that he is, again, an exemplar for all of us, for anybody who achieves that kind of state. But here we have to make a distinction between what's called Nibbana with remainder or with residue and Nibbana without remainder or without residue. And these are technical phrases that are kind of a mouthful, but basically I'll try to describe the difference between them. Basically it's Nirvana while you're still alive and Nibbana as you die and after death. So those are the two. That's a distinction we have to keep in mind. So, for example, in one of the early texts, we get this description of Nibbana with remainder, with residue. It says, basically we say the Arahant, the person is fully awakened. However, his five sense faculties remain unimpaired, by which he still experiences what is agreeable and disagreeable and feels pleasure and pain. It's the extinction of attachment, hate, and delusion, or greed, hatred, and ignorance in him, that is called the Nibbana element with residue left, or Nibbana with residue. So in other words, to experience the awakened state is basically to be in a state without greed, hatred, and ignorance regarding the Noble Truths. So that is what Nibbana is. It's not an extinction of pleasure and pain. It's not an extinction of our feeling tone. We don't get beyond our feelings. Our feelings are kind of a basic level in our lives as long as we are alive. They're part of having a body, as it were. But then we get on to the next stage, which is Nibbana element without remainder. And the text says, "For him, here in this very life, all that is experienced, not being delighted in, will be extinguished. That, bhikkhus, or monastics, is called the Nibbana element with no residue left." So all that the awakened being, or indeed any of us, experience in this life is extinguished as we die. The body becomes cold, that life is over. Or indeed all life is over, depending on how we describe it, depending on the case. But the question is, what is the distinction here? And the distinction seems to come with this idea of not being delighted in, that the experiences of life are not delighted in. And as a result, we have the Nibbana element without remainder, or what happens after the awakened being passes on. But what we need to focus on, therefore, as we're getting, as we're thinking about getting towards awakening, which is of course something that's well in the distance for many of us, but nevertheless, to keep it in mind, is what that not being delighted in really means. And I'm going to read another text here. I'm sorry about reading so many texts. This is unusual for me, but we try to focus on the early texts, and I think it's important to realize that a lot of what we learn about Buddhism comes from these texts. And so it's, I think, at least important to focus on competent translations, good translations of these texts into English, so that we can get something of a flavor of what was really being talked about. Because I can translate it into modern terms, but I think it's helpful in these cases where we're talking about really kind of subtle issues to at least start with the old texts. So the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta, which is a sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, talks about the inner experience of the awakened being, the inner experience of a Buddha, if you like, what it's like to be such a being, what it's like to have attained that state. And I think this is a very interesting, indeed fascinating kind of investigation, because we're sort of out of the ordinary stream of human experience and into the experience that is really quite different and unique. So what it says there is, again, talking about the awakened being, if they feel a pleasant feeling, they understand that it's impermanent, that they're not attached to it, and that they don't take pleasure in it. If they feel a painful feeling, they understand that it's impermanent, that they're not attached to it, and that they don't take pleasure in it, or you might say, don't lament it. If they feel a neutral feeling, they understand that it's impermanent, that they're not attached to it, and that they don't take pleasure in it. So in other words, they go through the normal experiences of life without emotional attachment to them, without identifying with them. If you like, they go through these experiences of life, whether they're pleasant or painful, with equanimity. They understand that they're pleasant, or that they understand that they're painful. They can feel the pleasantness or the pain, but they hold those kinds of experiences with equanimity, without any emotional attachment to them or emotional reaction against them. So in other words, by having this kind of equanimity, they're not emotionally involved in their pleasant or unpleasant experiences. And that is the distinction, the key distinction between the mental life, if you like, of an awakened person and the mental life of the rest of us who are not awakened, is that we tend to get emotionally involved in the pleasant and unpleasant states in our own lives. So when we hear the Four Noble Truths, and I'll put up a link to my video on the Four Noble Truths in case that's new to you, but the third noble truth is the noble truth of the ending of suffering. And from what I've been saying on this video, you might be confused. You might say, well, but you've just told us that pain doesn't end. with the attainment of awakening. But here we have to make a kind of a subtle technical distinction between what we might call pain and what we might call suffering. Pain, at least in part, is physical, is the kind of physical pain or even raw mental pain of a certain kind that we can't really escape, that just comes up, arises in front of us because the thing in front of us is painful. We're cut by a knife, we eat some food that's not agreeing with us, our back hurts because we've been sitting up too long, perhaps even we contemplate certain kinds of very unethical behavior. That mental image may simply immediately create a kind of a mental pain along with it. Suffering, however, is something else, at least on the Buddhist understanding here. Suffering is our lamentation, our mental anguish, our mental proliferation around pains and pleasures. Of course, the anguish and lamentation would be around mental pains, but you can also think in terms of mental pleasures as well, physical pleasures as well, of being our sort of grasping towards them, of our involvement in them, of our identification with them, of our feeling lamentation when they end, of our feeling mental anguish when they come to an end. All of these are wrapped up in what's called suffering in Buddhism. It's, in another sutta, very famous sutta in the early texts, is known as the second arrow. So the first, if we think of ourselves having been shot by an arrow, of course that arrow is painful. But if we then lament that pain, if we then mentally proliferate around that pain by sort of thinking about it, obsessing over it, that's the equivalent of sticking ourselves with a second arrow. So the first pain doesn't go away, it doesn't help that first pain, it simply adds to it by adding a layer of suffering over the original pain. So then in the Buddhist picture, are we ever able to get away from the physical pain as well? And the answer to that is in the Nibbana element without remainder, if you like. So the Buddha gives a simile of an oil lamp, where the physical body and life within it is like an oil lamp with a flame. And the flame continues so long as there's oil in the lamp. Once the oil is run out of, once the oil is extinguished, then the flame is extinguished, and the life of the flame comes to an end, and that's the end of it. And the same way, the life of the awakened being, when it comes to its natural end, simply goes out the way the lamp light goes out when it's out of fuel. And at that point, of course, the body comes to an end, the body gets cold, and all of the feelings, experiences that come with having a body, such as pleasant and unpleasant, cease existing. We cease having those kinds of experiences. Now, on a traditional understanding, this is of course very important, because on a traditional understanding, we have the unending cycle, or I should say the beginningless cycle of rebirths. And the beginningless cycle of rebirths involves, of course, pleasure and pain at all times. However, when we reach awakening, then that beginningless cycle of rebirths has its end. And so as we come to the end of the life that has seen awakening in it, we come to what's called parinibbana, the ultimate extinction, then all pains cease, because we've come to the end of the physical body and it's not going to be reborn. Now, on a more secular understanding, of course, we may say that we don't necessarily accept rebirths, or at least we are agnostic about it. We don't really care about that. What we care about is practice within this life. And so we may agree that, yes, at the end of our lives, our pains will come to an end. But what we want to know is how to live the best sort of life, how to live a life of what some people call radical acceptance, of being able to be at peace and at ease and equanimous with everything that arises within our experience, including the pleasures that arise and including the pains that arise, and including the great things that we see around us every day, and including the really horrible and terrible things that we see around us every day. And that's something that is, again, it's very hard to achieve. It takes a lifetime of practice. For most of us, if not even more than a lifetime of practice. But what we're trying to do, I think, many of us, is to bring that kind of experience, that kind of realization, to this very life. looking at whether the Buddha felt pain, I think, is instructive in that regard, because it tells us that, look, even if we get to our final goal, we can't expect to remove physical pain from the equation. I know several people who have chronic pain conditions, who do meditation regularly, and they all tell me that the chronic pain is not something that goes away. It's not that you get away from the pain. It's still there. What happens is that you're better able to deal with it in an emotional way. You get away from the emotional turmoil, the anguish, the mental proliferation around that pain. Because oftentimes if we have physical pain or discomfort, we tend to identify with it. We tend to ask, why me? We personalize it. And again, we come into this kind of mental proliferation, so that as the pain comes and goes, we're stuck with the proliferation. Worrying about what the future is like, worrying about what the past, or lamenting the way the past was. Those are the kinds of things we can get away from. So I'd be interested in how all of this impacts your own life. Do you have physical pains that you worry about, that you obsess over sometimes, that you lament about? Is it the kind of thing where a practice of meditation and of these kinds of Buddhist practices from the early tradition, have you found them helpful to you? Or other Buddhist practices, say Zen meditation, or something from the Vajrayana tradition, whatever it happens to be. Whatever is useful to you, I think you should pursue, so long as it doesn't have its own problems coming up down the road. I mean, as long as it's a wholesome practice, then I think we should consider using it. So thanks so much for being here. Thanks to all my Patreon friends. If you're interested in joining and reading some of the stuff over there, click the link down below, and it'll take you over there, and you can take a look. But thanks so much again, and we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. So meanwhile, be well.